So the Metics in my universe are a group of 8 characters that I originally developed as just as simply as heads, because I wanted some kind of human scale to be added to landscape paintings, which I was making from sort of 2010. I built 8 heads out of polystyrene and bits of toys and things, and started painting them into the landscape paintings. They would be they were like heads on signposts, kind of like you'd find in westerns, with the skull on top. But I didn't want a skull, so I made these heads, and the signposts would announce the title of the painting. I just added a kind of scale to these landscape paintings with these kind of floating vessels in them. But over time, they started developing, in my mind, they started developing characters of their own, and they were kind of a way to pin various parts of, I guess, the alienation of living in 21st century Europe. And then I thought, well, they could actually start telling a story, so I started writing little stories to go with the exhibitions, and even songs. I started writing songs that we performed with Red Horses of the Snow. And I liked the idea that there was this whole drama that was going on all underneath within this landscape, which almost had nothing to do with the main feature of the painting, which were these sort of enormous alien invasion vessels which were floating in the air. Eventually I started focusing more on this drama, and I put together an exhibition in 2016 at No Format in Woolwich, which was titled The Metics. So I gave them the title The Metics because in ancient Greece, Metics were a sort of class of people who could live in a city-state, but they couldn't be part of it. They couldn't become a citizen. They could even rise to prominent positions within the city-state, but they could never truly be part of it. With this exhibition, all the 8 characters had names, and they started representing things almost like a kind of pantheon, but a pantheon of alienation. It's a sort of belonging, but not. It wasn't something personal. I mean, there was a sort of personal elements. You know, we were renting in London, which is one of the worst things you can be doing. Like, it's just horrible, and you feel you have no control over anything. And you sort of get moved on, and you don't have a choice about it, and then you try and find somewhere else to live. And you know, it felt like there was a certain part of society that were forced to become nomadic, which gave me the idea of this character for Ven. And Ven himself was named after a character in a Thomas Hardy novel called Return of the Native. He was this nomadic character that was selling the dye to dye sheep, to say, these are my sheep, you know, so you put your initial on them or something. But because he was selling this red dye, he was completely red. So he was almost like a kind of Deus Ex Machina character within the novel, and had this kind of otherworldly appearance because he was completely red. So there were sort of personal elements to it, but I thought the main feature of living in the UK or in Europe was a sort of alienation that things had sort of passed, and you weren't the sort of centre of the world anymore, and we were sort of the old world. And I guess in a way there was something romantic about it, but also there was a lot of pathos about it. The work that I was trying to make was sort of looking at painting. I mean, my God, we were told at college so many times that painting was dead. So painting is still dead, but it's been dying for a long time, right? And it's still going on. So it was something you sort of had to address in a way. I think as a painter, you felt a kind of alienation, even as an artist, obviously, but even just as a citizen of these countries, that you feel like the time's over. There's a sort of autumnal feel about it. And so the work that I was trying to make was in a way trying to take an established form of painting like landscape and investigate what would happen if you interrupt it with more modern technological means of production. There's a kind of beauty of feeling part of something yet not part of something. When we moved to Greece, it was again that kind of beautiful alienation, being sort of part and not part of it. And I think it's something that artists feel anyway. You know, you feel this beautiful alienation, that you're something outside of something. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. So I think there's a field for worshipping alienation as a force, and much like punk thought anger was an amazing thing, or Anselm Kiefer thinks destruction is a beautiful thing. I think alienation is also a beautiful thing. In terms of where we live, who we interact with, where our goods are produced, where we're buying things from, how we travel between destinations. I think cities have become very alienating places. There's a point where you travel between cities, and I think it's Paul Virilio said that the faster you go, the more sedentary you become. So if you're walking from one place to another, it's a lot of effort, and you ride a horse, and then you ride a bicycle, and then you get a motorbike, and then you have a car, and then you have a train, and then you have aeroplanes, and then eventually the final thing is that you're sitting in your seat and pressing a button on Zoom. And it's not to criticise it, but the faster you go, the more sedentary you become, and the less you interact on an individual one-to-one basis. Well, they're more, I would say, characters. They're more like a, as I said, they're more like a kind of pantheon. I started trying to use them to tell the story of the sort of 20th century leading up to where we are today. So there was a sense of having these 8 characters represent different facets of history, and their interactions were based around what actually happened over that period. But I only wrote fragments of stories, so it was definitely left to the viewer or the reader or whatever to piece together the story, and I didn't want it to be a complete thing particularly, more to be like something being uncovered, like some kind of archaeology that would slowly unveil something that could be pieced together. And I had people who were really interested in trying to put it together before I had. The characters themselves developed more over lockdown. When I had a little job, which was quite a big job, designing characters for a mobile game, and going through the process of doing that, just something I hadn't really done before, and going through the process of making these characters, I thought, well, why can't I do this? I really should do the same for my 8 characters. So it enabled me to move away from landscape and take on a new kind of genre of painting, which was portraiture. So I was moving off from doing landscape paintings and into portraiture and basing it around these characters. The characters had already been around for quite a while, and they'd slowly been developing their own distinct arena within the work. But at this point, over lockdown, we really started to focus in on developing them as characters, and they're all, as almost like characters in, the Italian sort of commedia dell'arte. They were almost like folkloric characters. And people, because you can put on a mask that says you're this character. You put on the mask of, I don't know all the names of the Italian characters, but Punchinello, everyone knows, okay, you're this guy. So I wanted them to almost look like they were wearing masks, and that they could be representations of the character, and it could also be people dressed as a character. That was my aim with these portrait paintings, anyway. I mean, I hope it's not in a cynical way, that they're a kind of negative pantheon, but they're almost like there's too much pathos in them, and these characters, they sort of interact with each other, but they're not sort of all powerful in the same way. In fact, they're kind of unpowerful. Because they're all in a bit of a mess. They're not really sure what they're doing. It's not really that important that you understand any of this stuff to look at a painting. Right? It's not. You can look at one of the paintings and understand it as a painting, but it was just. This is like the DVD extras, right? Is that this is a kind of a process of working, of finding a way to work, because it's hard to know what to paint or how to paint it. So you just find you find ways of working, and this was my way of working, and I got kind of into it. I'm interested in this kind of world building. So Cleo, who represents history, and Cleo is unambiguously the Greek muse of history, and there's Gregor, who is he represents exile. He is kind of homeless. He's lost his job. He's lost his family. In fact, he used to be a soldier. This is his character. He's Gregor. The name is from Metamorphosis, from the main character in Kafka's Metamorphosis. Marco is named after Marco Polo, who represents Western capitalism. Ven, who I talked about earlier, but he's a kind of nomad, but he doesn't mind being nomadic. He kind of revels in this status. He's named after the character in Thomas Hardy novel who sells the red dye and is covered in red dye. Jerome was named after Saint Jerome. He represents culture and religion, really, and the arts. And Photius represents communism, I guess, and he was named after a bishop that caused the schism in the Christian church. Ennio, who for some reason I don't know why, I've changed it to look like it's spelled like Ennio Morricone, but she's a very almost unknown Greek god. She's the goddess of destruction, but particularly of cities. And I think she features in one line of the Iliad. And Seth, who represents technological progress, technological acceleration, even. He's named after the scientist in Cronenberg's film The Fly, just to fuse biology and technology in a kind of gross body horror. I remember Lyotard wrote about this in a book called The Inhuman, back in, I don't know, 70s or whatever. And he was saying the computer cannot have the pain of the unthought thought. Like when Darwin had the thought of natural selection, it went against everything he believed and everyone believed. It went against the entire culture, and he didn't want to believe it. He had the pain of the unthought thought, whereas the computer can just throw it out with no issue whatsoever, right? There's no pain there. No. And this is the difference. You'll still need a human behind it, to have the pain of the unthought thought. But it's a great tool.
Yeah.
What it is an amazing tool. And I think it just gives birth to new forms of creativity. I've always been using technology in my work as a part of the work. So it's quite a natural thing to then just go into AI. You still got you still have to have an idea, and then you still got to present something at the end of it. And I know people are presenting prints of things that they've made in AI. I don't have an issue with it. It's not really my area, because I still feel some kind of loyalty to painting, and still want some kind of transformation. But I use AI and I use Photoshop, and I make sculptures in Blender, and technology is a big part of my practice. It's not the only part of it, because you still end up you're still sort of landing in the arena of painting, because that's the one that I'm interested in.